International Media TV. Television that listens to you.
Hi, I'm Johnnie Burrell. Welcome to the program.
Hi, I'm Bill Goldman, and we feel very strongly about the marvelous work that the College of Ethnic Studies gives to this university, to this community, to the larger communities. Dean Montero is a very significant figure nationally, and he's a member of our board of directors for the New Leader Scholarship Fund. So our connections are deep. My wife was a professor of psychology here for over 30 years and is now emerita. So we feel very pleased to be here and very connected. And we wish everyone to share the pride that we feel.
The College of Ethnic Studies and the Department of Africana Studies made history in 1968 when the strike for ethnic studies and black studies took place, the longest strike in the United States for black studies, and the only College of Ethnic Studies in the country. Africana Studies has made some great steps forward since its founding. When the students struck, it was for black studies. It was based on African and African American history because the curriculum at the university did not cover African people. In 1990 to around 95, the Department of Black Studies, now the Department of Africana Studies, made the decision to take the discipline to the next level, which was the African-centered level. And whereas before the discipline had been centered on African and African American history, the discipline became focused on that, but with the central focus on African philosophy, and as before on community involvement and community revitalization. And so we're the Department of Africana Studies now, I'm retired, but is still carrying out the work of preparing our youth for community revitalization and liberation in the 21st century.
Danny talks about a time when programs around the country were implemented that taught, helped, and mentored young people. One such program was implemented in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district back in the day. Danny came here to play one of his favorite games, basketball. I was teaching karate. We recall those long ago but not forgotten times, and Danny gives a shout out to the Paltangi Youth Center.
I want to give a shout out to Paltangi Youth Center. I know it from back in the day, long before it became a shelter, a very valuable and important shelter for homeless families, and long before it became a place where men and women who were down on their luck were able to get a meal and food and everything else. I used to play basketball there, but I can't play basketball. But otherwise, I'm giving a shout out to. All right.
Meeting Danny Glover and his wife Eliane Caballero has been a real privilege for me. Danny is not just an award-winning actor that we cheer for in Lethal Weapon and despised in The Color Purple. He is an award-winning director and producer, including projects such as this To Sleep with Anger, for which he won an Independent Spirit Award for Best Actor. In 2005, Danny Glover co-founded the Louverture Films, where he also produced very personal projects such as Trouble the Water, for which he won a grand jury prize at the Sundance Film Festival. He also has produced African Unite and Award Union Bamako. He has become an important critical figure in American cinema. But for us, more importantly, Danny is a global advocate for human rights. For his work in 2011, he was awarded the Freedom Award. This award honors supporters of civil rights that have an impact in their communities. He's a UNICEF ambassador, and he's also the ambassador for the UN International Decade for People of African Descent. Just to give you a little bit of what that major effort of the UN means, the UN Assembly proclaimed 2015 to 2024 as the International Decade for People of African Descent. With that, the UN wants the international community to recognize and promote and protect the human rights of people of African descent. From promoting respect and the fulfillment of human rights for people of American descent, to promoting the knowledge about the contribution of people of African descent, and to protect and make sure that international, regional, and national legal forms attack discrimination and issues oppression and institutional discrimination. Today, Danny will talk to us about education as a right and his work with the UN, a humanitarian whose tireless activism inspires us all. It's my honor to introduce Danny Glover.
Thank you. When I received the invitation to be here with you in celebration of the 46th anniversary of the College of Ethnic Studies, I received it both from Belinda here, Reyes, Professor Belinda Reyes, and also from Professor Ken Montara. They're both here today. And those of us who allowed me to have the privilege to be here. Little did I know that when I was going to take this opportunity, or exercise this opportunity, little did I know that I was going to end up in the middle of doing the film. So I had to fly in from Atlanta yesterday, spoke at the alumni luncheon, and I have to fly back after here to go to work tomorrow at 6 o'clock in the morning. So,
Wow.
But I said all that, if my hair looks a bit strange, I love my white hair. I love the meaning and significance of having my weird, but the director felt that he needed to buy my hair for the role. So that we get that out of the way. So if it would have, I don't know what it looks on film, but in the course of doing this, I've tried to put together some ideas and thoughts about that particular moment because it becomes a reference point in my life. You know, I came to San Francisco State in 1967, and then in 1968, with an extraordinary group of men and women. Some of them are here now. I see Nancy Mims here. I see others here who were here at San Francisco State. But I thought about that moment and thought about that moment for what it meant for not that moment in itself, but for the rest of my life as well. And it's continued to be a focal point in my life and how I see the world, how I reference the world. And I have referenced the ideas around being a citizen. So I prepared some comments, if you'll indulge me. In September of 1968, 47 years ago, my classmates and I and a diverse coalition of African American, Asian American, Latino, and First Nation students, progressive whites, and supportive faculty took deliberate action and risk against our collective exclusion and misrepresentation in the San Francisco State University curriculum. We demanded the creation of a college of ethnic studies that would house programs of study related to our histories and our community. American Indian studies, Asian American studies, black studies, and La Raza studies. San Francisco State was not the only school with an inadequate curriculum at the time, and we were not the only student activists to organize in hopes of transforming the nature of a public institution. In 1968 was a year of tremendous upheaval and reimagination. In the midst of major social and political activities nationally and globally, a few events will stand out and illustrate our generation and our sense of urgency. Students were on strike in Paris, Germany, Czechoslovakia, and were leading successful protests. The anti-war movement was a major issue in the face of a national election. Movements for liberation and major issue was a major issue in the face of that election. And movements for liberation and armed struggles were in full force in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Even high school students in East LA were staging walkouts to demand better school conditions and curriculum representation. There were also tragedies and setbacks. Dr. Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were assassinated in 1968, and reactionary elements of society began to foment a pernicious backlash against social progress toward racial inclusion. It was in this context that we were inspired to organize for our demands. We understood that all of these events were in and of themselves a confluence of decades of distinct political struggles in the broad-based advancement of the conditions of human beings worldwide. Our actions were no exception. In the area of domestic policy, the Higher Education Act of 1965 inspired us to begin thinking of education not only as a right, but as a critical process for the development of young people as socially and politically engaged citizens of the nation and of the global community. Against the backdrop of desegregation and the aims of the Act, inclusion and access were part of the cultural discourse that informed our action. As a component of President Johnson's Great Society, which itself was a major piece of this country's post-war World II policy agenda, the Higher Education Act heightened our expectations about the role public institutions must play in transforming American society for the better. Government, national, and subnational, particularly in California, were expanding through the development of infrastructure, development of public institutions, and education was a central driver of that growth. The cumulative historic momentum of all these movements and policies facilitated the establishment of the College of Ethnic Studies. In all honesty, the College of Ethnic Studies is a manifestation of a long history of struggles against the long-standing contradictory stratifications of American society. As organizers, we poured our collective experiences, knowledge, and perspectives into the synergetic coalition that was as eclectic as it was united. We moved away from experimental myopia toward the power, including not only race and ethnicity, but into the theoretical underpinnings of our agenda, but about class as well. Nonetheless, notwithstanding, we had room to grow from terms of incorporating gender in our approach. Because history was such a fundamental aspect of the curriculum from which we were advocating, we were especially observant that societal relationships were a reflection of history. In writing our own history of institutional transformation, but inside and outside of this institution, we understood that education had the power to recalibrate our experiences and to engage us in a process of struggle rooted in Grace Lee Boggs' brilliance and wisdom. The only way we're going to survive is to be able to take care of one another. Our success was then, to a great extent, due to the support and solidarity of we engendered in the surrounding communities, as well as the guidance and inspirational support we received from other activists, from the United Farm Workers Union, from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, from the Brown Berets, the Black Panther Party, among others. We align our concerns with their concerns, learn from their successes and failure, and ultimately saw our victories a triumph for society as a whole rather than as a source of personal edification. There have been many changes since 1968, both in terms of the context and the sense of urgency surrounding student and youth activism, and in terms of the institutional responses to community demands. The Rainbow Coalition, the Occupy movement, Black Lives Matter, for example, the expansion of all levels of government in the 1960s has abated, replaced by widespread ideological commitment toward reducing not only the size of public institutions, but also the reach of their mission. The space and resources in which the College of Ethnic Studies grew is now contracting. New identity, neutral systems of control have emerged to replace the more explicit systems of prejudice that were struck down. The expansion of the penal system and the proliferation of killings of young black men and women of color have become major systems of control, as Michelle Alexander has so powerfully framed in her book, The New Jim Crow. Jim Crow merely transforms into mass incarceration under the pretext of the war on drugs. School segregation has emerged as a major equity problem despite Brown versus the Board of Education, as students of color continue to attend segregated schools. Academic support programs for first-generation college students, particularly for students of color, have been under attack. For-profit colleges have arisen to, and in all other instances, exploit the failures of traditional higher education to truly practice radical racial inclusiveness. And the other private institutions have relied increasingly on outsourcing, starving the American economy of millions of working class jobs, creating an amorphous and nonetheless exploitive transnational economic structure. These fundamental changes leave us at the crossroads at which we must clarify our understanding of the underlying issues as well as what is truly at stake in our time. Our educational system was designed by forward-thinking minds like John Dewey in the context of an industrial revolution to train people to participate in the industrial economy. In that context, it was inclusive by default, at least by intent. In light of all that has transpired since 1968, we must take heed of Martin Luther King's classic introspective imperative and ask ourselves, where do we go from here? That is to say, what do we mean when we say education, and how do we approach it as a social concern? Is education's purpose place-based and rooted in the mission of producing citizens? What role will the broader community play as stakeholders? By what standards do we judge actions as transformative, and by what rubric do we draw distinctions between action and movement? How does what we have learned from the decades of struggle inform how and why we create coalitions? For the School of Ethnic Studies, especially, what real impact are we making in society? How are we shaping students as citizens and transformative beings? What form or forms of inclusiveness are we truly practicing, as opposed to which we intend to practice? How much does the present state of the program mirror its founding ideals? How can we today impact the history that will come to pass? How can we more fully engage students in imagining and creating systems of restorative justice and becoming the architects of our own rescue? While these questions may not have easy and direct answers, they outline a new cultural discourse that demands student action and engagement, as well as a reimagining for all of us to continue the needed initiatives like the College of Ethnic Studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I love the idea of thinking about education as a right. So why is it important to think about education as a right?
Well, I think I tried to kind of to work through that in a sense. And I think we have to work through when we talk about education as a right. I specifically mentioned the Act of 1965, and most of us have forgotten. Johnson signed a major act into being at a very extraordinary moment in this country's history, where you have the expansion of infrastructure, as I mentioned, the expansion, particularly in California. I was born and raised in California. Schools, housing, and there's so many governance and everything else. My first job after San Francisco State was in 1971 when I worked in the Model Cities program, and the opportunities that were available to us. Mm-hmm. But I think the much larger question is, what do we mean by education? Mm-hmm. And that is always one that is the important aspects, I think, for our reasoning for going on strike in 1968. But before that, when we think about education, and really think about that education at a moment where we see a process of de-radicalization within the system of education itself, a kind of, and even when we go to most elementary schools and we see armed police, or
history books being changed.
What we used to call them in the back day, rent-a-cops, you know, at the schools in some sort of. And in this atmosphere, what is the atmosphere of nurturing that we create with education? So when we say we outline the idea of education, what are we creating here? Yeah. What is the nurturing process that goes on with this whole process? Yes, it's important. And it's an easy catchword to say it's important. You know, but is our relationship with that is to create a bunch of Hispanic, a bunch of Latino, a bunch of Black, a bunch of Asian, Native Americans just to have degrees, doctorate degrees, and to begin to polish their hardware because they got this doctoral degree or whatever? Or is it transformative in a way? You know, or do we even, in a sense, you know, and I've been thinking about Julius Nyerere when he talked about the Ujima villages. When he established Ujima villages, the first thing he said after independence is that we don't want an Africanization of the process. We don't want Africans to replace what the former colonialists have done. And that's a major question when we have to see. What do we question when we talk about education? In that sense, where do we question what has happened to us in this process? In this whole process. How does this process now reinform us in some way and inform us in a transformative, imaginative way in which we can talk about new alliances, new relationships with what's happening? Are we dealing with, if we're dealing with climate change, say if the School of Ethnic Studies, the College of Ethnic Studies, we're dealing with climate change, our impact is say, how is it affecting people of color? I know for a fact that 22 of the countries that was most endangered species in climate change are in Africa. 22 of the 55 countries are most endangered are there. They're the ones. There's a city just 2,000 kilometers from Maputo, north of Maputo. They're not talking about how do we reverse climate change, they're talking about how do we evacuate?
Yeah.
How does climate change have impact it have on First Nation people? We know for sure the impact that it has in terms of Alberta and the impact it's had. How does it have impact on that? So how do we look at that now? How do we see that in a sense? And not only how do we see it, I think we have to see ourselves in education not only as citizens in the sense of being citizens, organizers too. Mm-hmm. There's an initiative right now that was on the ballot, and and that was Proposition I and Proposition F.
Yes. Yes.
Both of them affecting communities, both of them affecting working people, both affecting people of color and everything else. What do we mean? What is our responsibility to that? Mm-hmm. As scholars, as students, as citizens in the sector. And we talk about education from that sense of point. That's why I think education is important.
Yeah. We're in a very particular, I think international, in a very political space in which nationalism is growing, government services are being cut, education is actually being thought in some ways as not everybody needs to have an education. It's a lot of that rhetoric out in the world. As the College of Ethnic Studies, how do we respond to that? What is the role of us within that framework of society?
Well, I think the college, as I stated in my comments, that we were born not from our own simply actions that we took at a particular point in time. We came out of what was happening in our communities, in our respective communities. Mm-hmm. We were sent here as representatives of our community, not simply representatives of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And it says we took that serious. I know in the Baby on the in the Fillmore in the Western Addition where I'm from, I know that there were issues around gentrification, or we called it redevelopment back then. Yeah. And those are real issues that happened and impact. We were at those meetings in 1967, 1968 at Waco, Western Addition Community Organization. We were at those meetings, listening, hearing. So there's some way in which the relationship that we have not only to ourselves, mm-hmm. since what's the old adage? It takes a child, mm-hmm. it takes a community to raise a child. So that community that we have responsibility to that community. Yeah. And I'm saying a lot of that becomes rhetoric in some sort of way. And I'm saying that we weren't lost with rhetoric. we had our own rhetoric, but at least we tried to have some sort of sense of understanding what was happening and understanding our relationship with those particular communities. What made San Francisco extraordinary, San Francisco State rather extraordinary, at the time that they had a tutorial program. A tutorial program, it must have been about 13, 14 centers around the city. So we were directly engaged with the children mm-hmm. of those people who lived in those communities, whether it was the Asian American community, was the African American community, or the Hispanic community. Yeah. We're directly engaged in that. So I think on the one hand, I think that the school has to simply identify, to embrace these particular issues and to have a discourse about it. Yeah. It's learning. There should be, whatever we're talking about, we just mentioned now the decade of Afro-descendancy mm-hmm. that's happening. As Lois Worth always says, we're all Africans. Yeah. Whenever she starts to speak, she says, we know that we're all Africans, But where is that? What does that mean? Mm-hmm. Not only for us here, what does it mean for other struggles that are happening in the hemisphere mm-hmm. and other struggles that African descendants are happening, that they're dealing with in Europe? Mm-hmm. And we know for sure that we're dealing with that. We see the increased xenophobia. We're seeing the increased anger and tension around migration that's happening in every place in Europe against immigrants or African descendants or African descendants or people who are not the same. Yes. So I think part of our work has to be around that as well, and understanding that. This is an important moment because we see the reaction, is always the reaction, to issues around reparation. It's a major issue. Ralph Gonsalvo, the premier of the Grenadines, just gave a major speech at the OAS about reparations. Venezuela, under President Maduro, is holding a conference around reparations and a Congress around African descendants. Major groups within Peru and Venezuela and Ecuador and Colombia and Brazil have been talking about these issues around African descendants since the World Conference on Racism in 2001. So I think the time is right that we have to be a part. The School of Ethnic Studies had to be a part of that. I call it the school. I understand it's formerly the college, but I call it, if I refer to the school once, but it's the college. It has to be there. So integrating, what do we do here on campus with what is happening in the issues around the community, in the communities, respective communities we live in, and it's a no-brainer to me in some sense. You know, when I'm sitting around, when I'm riding around, and I'd never been about 8 days ago, last Saturday, just before the elections, man, I'm riding around with a lowrider, man. I'd never been in one of those cars before, bouncing up and down. And we're talking about, it's a brother, you know, my Hispanic brother, what he's doing. He's riding around, you know, talking about, you know, we got 15,000 signatures for Proposition I. We got to beat the drum. We got Proposition I because the mission is changing. The mission that I worked in 40 years ago is not the same. It's not the same mission, the vibrant mission that I work in. You know, we were talking about a friend of mine, Ramon Gonzalez. You know, we worked in there, and all the people that I remember from Larry Del Carlo, and all the kind of people that I remember from working in the mission back in the early 70s, everything else. It's changed and everything else. I mean, he's not afraid of change. The change happening, but where's the people?
We got to be part of that change.
Where's their voice in there? Where's the working city? I'm going to live in a city that I was born and raised in. I lived in New York for a while doing theater. I lived in Portland for a short period of time. But my primary life has been in the same city, in the same community since I was 11 years old. Live in the same community. What kind of city that I'm going to live in where people can't afford to live to live here? People can't afford to live here. Well, how far are you going to push them? You know, you're going to push them out to Sunnydale? You know, you're going to push them further out to Pittsburgh and places beyond that and everything else. Something has to happen about that. And we have to be, as a school, engaged in that. Now, that's another kind of setup. We're in the contradictions that we saw in 1968 aren't the same contradictions that we see now. They've morphed into some other kind of relationship because we have a great number of those people who we would expect to have been at the forefront of these struggles, not with us, because they made other choices. But so we have to build young leadership to challenge that. That's what Black Lives Matter is. That's what the Color of Change matters. That's what all these things, the Dream Defenders matter. All these groups that are coming up and talking and bringing up these questions. A major issue on the ballot, and the conversation is going to happen in presidential elections next year is mass incarceration. You know, where are the people who are working, doing the work, young people doing the work with Johnnie Alejandres down in Santa Cruz with Barrios Unidos and everything, working, trying to work, keeping young men on a path where they don't end up in the path around in jail. Those are the kind of things that we need to talk about in real terms. You know, the material is there for us out there. How do we understand in another way what history is? We have a framework when we look at history. And we often, that framework is imposed and everything. We don't look at rebellions, you know. You look in the high school book about rebellions, Denmark Vesey or Gabriel Prosser or whoever, or Toussaint, all these examples. We caught them and we killed them. We hung them. You know, we don't understand the nature. That was the appropriate. Our response is not the appropriate response that power has. We don't legitimize what they say and what they say. Where do we find this information? Where do we look at, like Edward Baptist's brilliant book, came out last year, Half Never Been Told. You might read it, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. Edward Baptist, brilliantly researched and everything else, and tells the story from the inception, from the ratification of the Constitution in 1789, all the way through from that particular point to the Civil War. and how cotton became the fuel that drove the first half of the Industrial Revolution. That's what cotton was. Cotton was that. Oil became that drove the next part of it. But cotton was that. And how it made the United States, by the 1850s, the most powerful country economically in the world. It made filthy rich the manufacturers, the manufacturing business in the UK and other places. How do we understand that? So we have some sort of context to talk about reparations.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, they're talking about reparations everywhere. You know, the brother who's Sir Hilary Beckles has been appointed by CARICOM as doing the research on reparations in the Caribbean. These are the kind of things that we have to be in tune to as well. And if anything, be a part of that discourse and understand the benefits of this. It's a radical pretext. It's a radical discussion. And it's not a discussion that's going to make people comfortable.
Yeah. Yeah.
But understand, this ain't about making people comfortable. This ain't about making people, we got to have that. It's not a minute. And we all see it right there. We all know it. We all live. Well, you know, it's very what's the name of this book? Rifkin's, I'm thinking his first name right now. The End of Work. Jeremy Rifkin's The End of Work. It's a chapter on black labor. And he says, he makes this profound statement. He says it wasn't the emancipation that freed African Americans from the land. It was the invention of the cotton picking machine in 1944. Up to 1944, 100% of the cotton was picked by hand. Within 20 years, it was in 2 generations, within 20 years, 25 years, 100% was picked by machine, displacing African Americans, making them expendable, you know, unnecessary. And what they did was they basically moved to cities. That's what Great Migrations happened at the beginning of the 20th century. Great migrations that happened. I mean, we count the land migrations to Oklahoma and other places in the 1880s and say, but the great migrations at the beginning of the 20th century, and in the 20th century, and particularly just before World War II as well. So we understand the reason why the migrations always have not because people are looking for work. In the industrial society, one is that's largely becoming more urban. You know, African Americans, like everybody else, were looking for work. So the great migrations happened through that period. We see the migrations that all migrations happen through a period where people are finding a way in which they can sustain themselves and make a living. So that's an important part of understanding the real reasons why, you know. And we celebrate that. We celebrate that. We celebrate migration with family reunions and different other places, bringing families together, finding family and everything else. We celebrate that. But I think it's important, and I'm not going to just you know, play into disvalue in that sense, but I think it's important to understand what does the future look like in terms of work itself. You know, one of the great unions in the history of this country, the ILWU, longshore workers, they were there, you know, you know the story about, people know the story about Harry Bridges when he went around to all the black churches in 1934 and said, you don't cross our picket lines, I make sure that black men will be on that after we win the strike in 1934. We know that story. But they're caught in the fix well because of automation and technology. And there's technology. We didn't talk about robotics, you know. And we didn't talk about nanotechnology, all the kind of, there's this place, you know, 33 countries in Africa depend on growing cotton. The impact that that's going to have on those economies and everything. So there's larger dynamics that are happening within the framework. So when somebody talks about job, I'm saying, what do we mean? We're going to create more jobs, you know, which is a bunch of the political rhetoric we always run into. But what are you talking about in jobs? If you're taking more jobs in terms of, as Jeremy said, that are beneficial to society and not based within this narrow framework of economic expedience or with a framework of the framework we often look at job creation, you know. And so I think the questions are there, but we're going to have, and I think we're going to have to step out of the way we thought of things. The wonderful thing about people know who Grace Lee Boggs is. Mm-hmm. Grace Lee Boggs lived 100 years and 100 days. In fact, she had been a part of movements in Detroit from the early 50s when Chinese American woman married an African American in 1953. You know, from Alabama. Chinese woman with a PhD. In fact, the FBI's files refer to her as Afro-Chinese. She must have. But in 1953, she married this brilliant, incredible organizer and thinker, Jimmy Lee Boggs. And she talks about in her book, she used the next revolution or evolution, as she says. The next revolution is what she says about how do we mean by growing our souls. What does she mean by that? In so many different ways. How does she take that idea after her experience with Marxist-Leninism, with involved in struggles around black nationalism, and all the kind of struggles around those things? What does she mean by growing our souls and creating these relationships, which are relationships that are certainly not certainly part of our own thinking, coalitions, relationships, and talking about who we are. What does it mean? What does it mean to be a human being? I've heard, as a Detroit fourth grade teacher, the first question he asks his students in the first, when they come to his fourth grade class, what does it mean to be a human being? The first question in philosophy. The question is, how do you know, is the second question. But those are the kind of things that we're going to have to find ourselves in. And we're talking about so many things that we've been through. And when we talk about organic farming, mm-hmm. we talk about the issues that around food security. And we talk about other ways of looking at restorative justice. Mm-hmm. All those kind of ways in which we're going to have to find ways in which we grow our soul. Yeah. Now, what does that mean to each of us? Could be different, mm-hmm. and yet in some places I suspect it's going to be the same mm-hmm. for the majority of us. We produced a film called The House I Live In with Eugene Jarecki. The War on Drugs. It's a beautiful song that Paul Robeson sings in this highlighting America in the 1940s. The House I Live In. It's a beautiful song. If you ever listen to it, it's great. It's just, it celebrates this whole idea of America, you know. They turned around and attacked him a few years later, you know. But it's really, we know, we have to find ways of building institutions, creating institutions, or using existing institutions, because you're either part of the formal economy or the informal economy. And the reality is, the truth of it is that the informal economy is the one that most of the people function in. And those people who are outside of it and have who are not inclusive in the formal economy, that's the reality of it. Mm-hmm. You know, and do we legalize drugs? I don't have these answers. You know what I'm saying? All I know is that when I went to Soledad Prison last Tuesday, I went to Soledad and Solano Prison down there about 120 miles here with Nane Alejandro. All I know is that there were men who were there who were trying to figure out, even some of them lifers, How do they change their life around? How do they be a voice to young people and young men and who are on the verge of perhaps going through their experiences, their same experience? How do they begin to turn that around or help them turn that around? How do you begin to build those institutions that support them, knowing that we don't have any answer for job creation? We can talk about different ways in which we look at work itself and the relationships theoretically, but how do they make a living? You know, I had the strangest thing to say to me some years ago. Two guys said this to me. I was at an event at the South African embassy. A young African-American man, my age, who came up to me at the time. I mean, we were both young then. But he said to me, man, he said, look here, I run a $4 billion corporation. He said, but I know something, I'm going to tell you this now. My son is not going to have the same opportunity to do that. My son is not going to be able to have the same opportunity. Now he's basically showing that this is what I've accomplished within the context, within the historic political context that I lived in. But my son isn't going to have that same institution, the same opportunity, you know. And then I just ran into someone else, some lady. He said, man, I'm trying to figure out how can I tell my son to get a computer job making $40,000 a year when he could make that much in a month or a week or less than that, selling drugs on the street. Those are some really issues, and they have to do with, I think they're ethical issues, but they have to do with the value that we place on money itself. That education is purely about making more money. You know, so that you fixated on making money as opposed to what kind of human being I am, and this what kind of transformative human being I am going to be, or can I possibly be? Those are real questions that we can ask. So you can say, I can say whatever I can say to these guys and to those women who are participants in the illegal side or the informal economy and everything else. But we got to find some other way in which we nourish them in another way. We celebrate, support them in another way. We create a foundation for them in another way. And it doesn't start when they start selling drugs. It starts before then. Yeah. You understand what I'm saying? A friend of mine was doing a paper, and she was saying, why does, a question, she's a professor of education. She was saying, she was doing a paper on why do kids, children, and whether white, black, why do kids lose their curiosity by the 4th grade? In a situation, in an educational system that doesn't take them to look at themselves as a whole human being. And we know that the testing is not about teaching. Testing is essentially about accountability, making some numbers, getting some up. Testing is about that. We know that. So how do we begin to shape that? In fact, probably some of the most aware children of the children in places like Seattle who boycotted testing, in a sense, and testing scores and being characterized by the score numbers, the number of their score. So there are ways of, it's a conversation. But the conversation can't be, how do I get them not to sell drugs? The conversation has to be, go back here for some other kind of route, some other place where we got to search our souls and grow our soul to say, these are the reasons, what can we do and able to enhance the other possibilities that they have, enhance the possibilities that they are as human beings. Well, let me say this, you know, and I say what power attempts to do in this way, in this most, what it attempts to do is first of all, diminish your expectations. It's always doing that. Diminish your expectations of yourself, first of all. So on the one hand, and it does something else, it diminishes the expectation in different ways. It knows, it begins in a process. It knew that there were young people coming out of World War II, like my father. We better create some opportunities for them. We better make it easy for them to get a job at the post office or some other place. We got to open up the federal space there. It knew there were a group of baby boomers who were coming out of college. We better create some opportunities for them. EOP program, you know, the EOC program, model cities, et cetera, war on poverty, all the kind of, all the things was there. It created that. But it creates a certain class who has another, they don't have another agenda is not what I want to say. But in some sense, it elevates and reprioritize, I think, the expectations of movement building. So you come out of these moments and say, and then the disconnect with movement. There's sharp moments in American history where there's a moment where radicalization that happened, where you have the Emma Goldmans, you have the Eugene Debs, you have who runs for president from prison, you have the boys in Harlem. You have all those things. There's a moment of radicalization that happens. You have the Robesons, you have the C.L.R. James, and I can go on and on, the litany of names that you have or will come out of that period of time. At some point in time, those ideas are now either compromised by, one, destroying that level of radicalism. You destroy it, you undermine it, you destroy it. I remember being at lunch during Mandela's inauguration with Julius Nyerere, my hero, one of the great men of the world, Julius Nyerere. And he and Tiny Rollins, you know who Tiny Rollins is? Tiny Rollins is Rhodesian. Tiny Rollins controls mind not only in Zimbabwe, but controls mind in South Africa. He and him have a tense argument. They can have this argument at nearly 80 years old now. And he tells him, Julius Nyerere said, you're the one, and specifically pointed to him in this discussion. It was very uncomfortable as they got into this kind of, it was a little civil than that, but it got into discussion. You're the one who destroyed my country. You're the one. You're the one right there. You're the one who undermined my country and its possibilities and everything else. And not too many countries have been able to say that. You can say not too many countries, not too many communities have been able to withstand that. So the ideas of breakfast for children, you know, the ideas of free education, the idea of free medical care, they don't start because somebody in Congress steps up and said we want to do it. They start at the bottom right there. Mm-hmm. And the idea is to undermine those and to subvert those kind of things. And I think that's what happens. All the leaders, and there's got some great people. I love Maxine Waters. I love Barbara Lee, and I love all of them. They're in Congress. They're not here. Mm-hmm. You understand? And the change has always happened when it was out here throwing spaghetti at the door, beating down the door. That's when change happened. It happened. So in the period of you had movements, and you can see the translation of movements. You had 1 million workers expelled from the CIO in 1949, expelled because they wouldn't take the plan. Radicals. It's always, how do you think that you got unemployment insurance? How do you think you got Social Security? How do you think that it got, you think frankly, FDR said benevolently we're going to get them, that people were on the streets fighting for it. People were the free, that's how it is. It's been that, it's historically and everything. How has that happened? And each time, the power tries to erode that in some sort of way. And always taking it away, a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. Then you have a bunch of fanatics around here talking about being president. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? I mean, and to be honest, and they call that a town hall discourse. Huh? You know what I'm saying? The reality, the mindset around migration, immigration. You know what I'm saying? So I think that one of the things that we have to think about this is how do we create sustainable activism in the 21st century? Mm-hmm. sustainable activism in the 21st century. And what does that mean? Because we can't move from the vantage point that let's throw all the old ideologies out the window. You know, we have the Occupy movement. You know, that's something that's happening. People, let's throw all those out the window. Let's talk about what does it mean to be a human being. What kind of work do we have to do? Build communities. How do we build that community, the beloved community that King talked about? King understood it. When he said we have to be a more people-orientated society than a thing-orientated society. How do we begin to do that? And those are the kind of ways I think that are important for us in what the conversation is. And the conversation, as I said yesterday, is peace. And as King said, peace is not simply the absence of hostility, but the presence of justice.
Yes. Help me thank Danny Glover.
These are just small mementos that we'd like to offer to you, Mr. Glover. And I like to say Mr. Glover. I like to say Mr. Glover. I like to say Mr. Glover. The first time I saw him was in Sisway. Bonzi is dead in the mid-'70s, and the man floored me. Floored me when he portrayed a South African man who, in order to survive, to live, had to procure the identity of another South African man and what it meant to have to shed his own and own someone else's for both lives to live, because the first one had been physically killed, but how did both of them live? How did both of them live? By one adopting the identity of the other. So Mr. Glover, and I do basically know what's on here, which is good because I cannot see it without my glasses. For your service to the College of Ethnic Studies and your commitment to relevant, excellent education for all, on November 8th, 2015, the purity of the crystal and the insignia of the college. We'd like to offer this to you while you're flanked by our president and Mrs. Wong.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And those of you who have been enjoying Delicato's gracious wines that were donated by that winery, the Delicato family winery.
Okay.
They gave me a special bottle. You all had wonderful wine. I hope you're enjoying it. So all wine that they create is equal. Some bottles are a little bit more equal than others, and we saved this for you to take home. On those days when you and Ileana are actually able to sit at your table here in the city and enjoy it. But we want to thank you for really feeding us today, feeding us.
Well, I just want to thank you. You know, sometimes there's so many people here that I've known. I remember a gentleman who taught here, and I remember first hearing him speak in 1966 at a conference, Black Power conference in 1966. I remember he had a house on Fulton Street, and every Sunday I'd find my way there to listen, to meet other people. Dr. Obush, stand up, Obush. Obashaka. And there's so many people, you think about all the things that nurture your life, those moments when you search out, you hear people, you listen to them, and they add so much to what you feel and the direction that you're going. And there are countless people, there are many. I can name all the ones that who are, and think about them. And I see them sometimes when I'm here at San Francisco State or where I'm in the city. That's the beautiful thing about the city itself. I remember she was a wonderful, gracious, and still is wonderful and gracious woman who came to interview us, to talk about in 1967. Of course, she was just beginning in the midst of changing what the city looked like, or what we thought programming looked like, as an anchor in Belva Davis. I remember her coming to us, and these students with their hair a little long and everything else, and in some sense, giving us an audience and a place, and allowing our voices to be heard. And there's so many opportunities there. And I'm so glad that there's so many young men and women in the audience, because they're there too for you. But Paul Robeson said that each generation makes its own history, and they'll be judged by the history that you make. And you'll be judged by the history that you make. Thank you.